Okay, so I'd like to welcome everybody to number 92 of the Circle of Wine Writers Let's Talk About sessions. And this is our webinar series, which we began during COVID times. I'd like to extend a particular welcome to those of you who are not Circle members and joining us for the first time. The Circle of Wine Writers was founded in the UK in 1960 by wine writer Cyril Ray, and today we have over 260 members around the world, and our split is between 50% UK and 50% the rest of the world. And we comprise wine writers, broadcasters, educators, and other professional wine communicators. You'll find more about us on the website, and including details of joining. Do not hesitate to contact me or talk to one of our members for more details. Please note that if you're not a member, you can be added to the mailing list to be invited to such events. You just have to go to About on our website, and our email contacts are there. I'd now like to hand over to Circle member Neil Hulkower, who's based in Oregon on the west coast of America, but he's currently holidaying in Hawaii. So thank you, Neil, for joining us. And he will introduce our speaker today, who is based in California. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you. I'm pleased to introduce fellow Circle member Randy Caparoso, who's a wine journalist and photographer based in Lodi, California. He's an author of Lodi, the Definitive Guide and History of America's Largest Wine Growing Region. He's also editor-at-large for the Somm Journal and writes for the Lodi Wine Grape Commission. He's been a published wine journalist since 1981, when he began writing a biweekly wine column for his hometown daily newspaper, the Honolulu Advertiser. Strangely enough, I happen to be in Honolulu right now, so I'm visiting his hometown. Between 1978 2001, he worked primarily as a Somm and award-winning multi-unit restaurant co-owner, operations manager, and wine director. Randy will now enlighten us as to why are there more old vines in Lodi than any other region in America. Randy, over to you.
Thank you, Neil. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and your interest in little old Lodi, which is ironic because a lot of people don't know that we grow more grapes in all of Sonoma County and Napa Valley combined. So it's by far the largest wine growing region in the United States. By the way, more than all of Washington State and Oregon State combined, plus another 25%. So it's pretty large, but it's, I guess I say little old Lodi because a lot of people associate Lodi with more of what the French would call vin ordinaire. And yes, it's true. A lot of the grapes go into lower price value wines. But what a lot of people forget is there are large producers such as Gallo or any others that up until 30 years ago took most of the grapes from Napa Valley and Sonoma. And so therefore, these kind of places supply grapes because they're good to grow. So, and that steers us into old vines because they're a lot more interested these days in that. And of course, in France, you know, we grew up, and I started in the industry in the 70s, knowing about the concept of Vigne in France, and I was a big fan of German wines. And one thing I did notice many years going to Germany, how many of those grape vineyards along the Mosel in the Rhine were actually old vines, 50 to over 100 years old. Because how often do you want to replace those things growing on 45-degree angle vineyards? And so there is prospects of old vine organizations all over the world now. In 2011, a group of California producers put together something called a Historic Vineyard Society, a nonprofit, which they thought was high time to promote old vines and hopefully preserve them. I love the entire concept of Barossa old vine, especially as you can see in that graphic, how they like to divide the various ages of old vines in the Barossa: old, survivor, centennial, ancestor. I think it's a great idea, and I wish more places, even in Lodi, would do things like that. Of course, we all know that there's now the Old Vine Registry, which started, I believe, I guess, last July or August, and it's the first crowdsourced database for old vines. And then there's a South Africa Old Vine Project, which I love. If you look at the graphic there, there's it's a example of the logo and the back label on a Sensol Pinotage. Um, and I think that's a great idea. I wish we would do that. And the Historic Vineyard Society likes to put out signs like you see in this graphic, this photo here, of their old vine certified vineyards. And there are about 250 of them right now in California that are certified by Historic Vineyard Society. So here's a picture of a Zinfandel planted in 1901, and goes into a wine called Lodi Native, and you can see how it promotes the idea of Lodi by putting the name of the vineyard on top, and the name of the winery, and the varietal is understated. So the value of old vines is first, economic. They exist wherever there's an economic need for it. So there are about 16,000 acres of old vine Zinfandel, for instance, in Lodi, and maybe another 4,000 of various other grape varieties such as Sansol, Cordon, and oh. Well, and a few other oddballs, but those are the major ones. But the only reason why they exist is because there was economic value given to them. A lot of people are aware, for instance, in California, Zinfandel was made into a red wine up until the 1960s. And somewhere in the early beginning of the 1980s, there was an explosion of white Zinfandel in California, and a very popular wine that could be sold for $4.99 or $5.99. And that came at the same time that people suddenly found access to $5 and $6 Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay. So it was a time when people started drinking varietal wines, and white Zinfandel was right there with it. And if it wasn't for the popularity of that fruity sort of pink style of wine, there really wouldn't be 16,000 acres left of a Zinfandel in Lodi. They would be all gone, because if you recall, in the 1980s and 90s, and California went to the classic varietal grapes such as, Cabernet, Merlot, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc. And so Zinfandel would have been pulled out long ago if it wasn't for the fact that it was needed to make white Zinfandel. Um, but there's the other factor behind the existence of old vines, especially in a place like Lodi, and is that you basically need a healthy environment to grow it. Now, healthy environments for vines to live longer tend to be found, but not exclusively in Mediterranean climate zones, because grapevines are very comfortable in Mediterranean climate zones. And here's a map that pretty much shows where you can find them. And not coincidentally, you find a lot of old vines in those kind of areas in South Africa, California, South Australia, and just in around the Mediterranean basin. The other factor, of course, is you need that coincidence of high vigor soils. And when grapevines are trained as close as possible to natural predilections of grapevines, I think it's important to remember, even though older vines when they're spur pruned, tend to look like little trees. Grapevines, in fact, are not trees. They're vines. And so vines are in their natural state, just grow. The canes just go on and on and on. They go through trees and they go everywhere. You see some parts of the world where they're still allowed to be cultivated in that fashion, but the closest thing to that natural state is, what the French would call a gobelet, or a head trained spur prune vine. And I have some graphics here of various types of ways in which grapevines are trained. But I think basically, grapevines train on stakes in, say, a gobelet fashion. They're allowed to grow three-dimensionally, and that fits in more in the natural state of the grapevine as a creeper type of vine, or as they call it, I guess, in Australia, a bush type grapevine. So here's a picture of sand salt in Lodi. Was planted in 1886 in a hole dug underneath on one side of the vineyard. And it's a good example of the type of environment in which a grapevine grows very, very easily. Now, keep in mind, this particular vineyard consists of 25 acres of sand salt growing on their own rootstocks, and this is about 25 feet of sandy loam soil. You can see it's consistent. You see water creeping up just 20 feet below the surface. And this particular soil, in fact, is consistent down to 90 to 100 feet in this particular area in California. So you've heard of sandy loam soils. They're found all over the world, where you find grapevines grow very well. Vines like sandy loam soils. It's loose, it's porous, but this particular one is alluvial. It's decomposed granite. And so it's basically about 50, what you're looking at is about 15,000 years worth of just layering and layering a very rich soil. So it's extremely high in vigor. So it's not a poor soil. And so grapevines thrive in that because they like rich soils, but they also like good drainage. So that's your ideal. And it's a 10 by 10 spacing. And so the vines are allowed to grow as individual plants in a very healthy environment. I can't overemphasize that. You need a healthy environment to, say, minimize fungal diseases like Eutypa, and obviously, what's well known, of course, about these type of grapevines growing on single stakes is they also have ideal canopies, and allowing, maximizing sunlight at the same time, minimizing sunburn on grape bunches. So all in all, just a good area for grapevines to be very, very healthy. I'll make one more point. In almost all years in this particular vineyard that you're looking at, that the yields are somewhere between 3.5 to 4 tons. And so this whole idea that, oh, it's an old vineyard, it must be only a 1 or 1.5 acre ton per acre production. Well, that's a very expensive grape growing. In Lodi, you pretty much need grapevines to be productive and to have fairly good yields. And I would say 3.5, 4 tons is a good yield, and it's enough for the wine to be profitable. Vineyards are never they're never useful unless they're profitable. Let's just That's just as simple as I can put it. Here's a picture of a Goblet train grapevine that's quite large, planted in 1960, and typical of a lot of most older vines in Lodi. It's growing on its own rootstock. So obviously, but I don't really need to say it, but in sandy loam soils, you can grow on your own rootstock, even without the danger of phylloxera. Below in this picture is a vineyard that's grown on what we call a vertical cordon. So instead of being a head train where all the spurs come out of a head only 2 feet off the ground, it's all the spurs are positioned upwards, anywhere from 1 to 5 feet high. And so these grapevines, by the time their canopies come in, they're over 6 feet tall. And this is ideal also. It's maybe it's not ideal in a low vigor site, but in high vigor sites like we have in Lodi, it is ideal because you get better canopy and cluster balance, which is the whole idea behind high quality grape growing. And so you you might have, say, a disadvantage because, as everyone knows, there is such a thing as, um, uh, apical sort of balance where most of the growth is going towards the top. And so you have the most canopy, maybe the largest clusters at the higher end of a grapevine like that. But in certain varieties, such as Zinfandel, variation of grape cluster in size is actually good. It actually can increase complexity of the wines coming off of those type of grapevines. So the obvious disadvantage of either spur prune or vertical cordon trained vines is they do need to be cultivated by hand. You can't really do that by the machine. And in this day and age, that is becoming the biggest challenge of all in terms of cost or just having people out there. I mean, there are about 110,000 acres of grapevines total in Lodi. And believe you me, finding the people to go out there and say at this time of year to prune them within the space of 2 months is almost next to impossible, but somehow it's being done. Lodi started a program called Save the Old. It's kind of a marketing thing where we're trying to remind people that it's good to have old vines, and it's good for Lodi because it is in a lot of respects symbolic of the region. We have Lodi does grow at least 40% of the Zinfandel production in the entire state of California every year. So we do grow a lot of Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon and Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Gris, just like everyone else. But Lodi, the heritage grape is Zinfandel, and we like to think also Sansalt and Carignan, classic Mediterranean varieties that go great in Mediterranean regions such as this. So old vine is relative. I guess I wanted to make that point. And in Napa Valley in these days, if you have a grapevine that's 25 to 35 years old, that's actually considered an old vine because most vineyards in those type of regions are only 15 or 18 years old at the most. And which is great because those are areas where Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Cabernet Sauvignon, and Merlot, and Cabernet Franc do very well, and that's what and that has made for a great success for those particular regions. But those are all planted within the past 20 years. In Lodi, we consider grapevines over 60 years old to be old vine simply because it was during the early 60s when the industry as a whole changed, where it started going into a rootstock grafting and also into trellising. And so even in Lodi, most of the vineyards planted in the mid 60s or after we're on rootstocks and we're on trellis because that represented state of the art. So most of our old vineyards in Lodi, they were planted in the early 1960s or before, as long ago as the 1880s. Now, what's more important, vine age or vineyard site? Well, here, from our perspective in this region, it's both are important. It's not coincidental to find vineyards that are of use, that are economically viable and healthy in the best sites. So, no question. So, I think having grapevines to be of a certain age is an advantage, but as it were in the industry, the grapevines that are of a certain age are in the best sites. So better though is always a matter of perception, and but what we have found in our own experience, and what I mean by we is the various wineries, is the older sites have a tendency to produce higher quality wine. And higher quality wine can be perceived in many different ways. Is it intensity? Is it color? Amount of phenolics? Or as people are starting to become more familiar with old vine bottlings, they aren't necessarily looking for wines that are more intense or darker or deeper in color. I think in a lot of ways, consumers and media and trade are starting to come away with the idea that the best wines are wines that represent their sites as opposed to say a varietal intensity. So what growers here and wineries have found that when you have sites where there are older vines with younger vines, the older vines tend to produce uh, more more intensity, a little bit more phenolics, and a little bit better balance. And so I think when you compare a younger vine with an older one, there's no question that the older ones have a tendency to produce a higher quality wine. So then you come to the question of, are wines from own rooted vines better than grafted vines? As far as we know, no, not necessarily. Site still trumps a matter of whether a grapevine is on its own roots or on a grafted root. So it's hard to tell the difference, but when we make distinctions between the vineyards that we're familiar with, it's not so much whether a grapevine is on its own roots or on, say, St. George. It's more like all the other factors having to do with terroir, the soil type, the location, the aspect, everything that makes a vineyard unique. Here's a unique picture on the bottom of this screen where you're seeing a very old vine planted in 1903 next to younger vines planted in the 1970s, and you can see in this particular vineyard, the younger vines were trained as vertical cordons rather than as head trained vines, and that head trained vine is so old that the trunk is relatively very short compared to those spurs. So it's turned into some kind of monster, I think. So here in Lodi, we've had certain projects, such as Lodi Native, where we've had winemakers produce wines from select heritage vineyards that are older. And the most illuminating part of that is how we've been able to discover the distinctions among sites. So you can have a vineyard that was planted in 1915 right next to a vineyard that was planted in 1918, and say they're both own rooted, and they're both pretty much cultivated the same way over a period of over 100 years. But they produce similar but wines that are very distinctive. One could be a little more delineated and more fragrant. The other one could be more fruit focused and more spicy. Even though they're right next to each other, which is, of course, the essence of the whole idea of terroir and say the whole appellation system in France or in Germany, where you're not thinking of vineyards as one producing a better wine from the other. You want each vineyard to have its own character. I mean, you do not want Lafite to taste like Latour, and Latour does not. You don't want Latour to taste like Mouton, etc. And the same thing for anything along the Mosel or in Spain or any other place where you find really high quality wine. So what is great about old vines is more than anything, from our perspective, is that the older the vine, the more tendency you have for a vineyard to express terroir, the quality and the characteristics of its own site. To me, that is what makes wine most interesting, and it's especially uh, um, becoming more important as consumers and media and trade are starting to understand that more than ever. I think just 15, 20 years ago, when anyone would say, what is the better wine? They would always point to a wine that was the darkest or richest in terms of red wine or even white wine. What's the fullest? What's the most intense? I would go to a judging in, say, Santa Cruz Mountains, and everyone was giving the highest scores or highest ratings to wines that taste most like their idea of, say, a Chardonnay grown in the Russian River. They weren't looking for a wine that tastes like it comes from Santa Cruz Mountains. And I'm talking about professionals here. So more people in the trade and in the industry, and as well as consumers. In a way, I think consumers are kind of tend to be ahead of trade and professionals in a lot of ways, and that they're appreciating wines for the taste of where they come from, as opposed to how intense they are, or how much like a Cabernet or Chardonnay tastes like, etc., or how much they taste like a Burgundy, or how much they taste like a Bordeaux, or whatever which way we used to judge wine. I think the advantage these days is people are going a little bit beyond that. They're starting to appreciate the entire idea of terroir, and that's where old vines come in, because the deeper your root system, the longer grapevines have adapted to a particular site, the more likely they are going to produce a wine specifically from that site in terms of the sensory qualities. And that, to me, is the essence of terroir, and the essence of what you want in a wine that can be considered of great value. So in conclusion, I think the future of old vines is very bright indeed, because basically, people appreciate them more as old vines as opposed to something else, where people might say, oh, it could be a lot better if we just tore the whole thing out and planted some, new Cabernet and new Chardonnay and make more interesting ones. Well, just in time, people are starting to appreciate the old guys. All right, now, any questions or comments?
Okay, Randy, thank you very much for that presentation. Yes, there's been a number of comments and observations. I think a number of people have made in saying that Winnie was saying that there's a special seal for the South African old vines depicting the year that the vineyard was planted, and Belinda from the Old Vine Conference says yes, the work they've been doing is unmatched and is setting a standard for a number of people. Richard Lane was saying about some Shiraz vines in South Australia date back to the 1840s. And Michelle was saying about some vines going back to 350 years old in Italy, in the Novarese countryside. Are you aware of a number of those? I would have thought.
Yeah, no, I'm not. And so, because, my focus has been, pretty much American wine. And so that is astounding to hear. 350. Yeah. I've certainly been to South Australia in a couple of occasions and made a point of seeing a lot of the old vineyards as old as the 1840s and 50s and 60s. And that's very impressive indeed. And so I think the phenomenon of that is the Shiraz again was of value. And so if people didn't use it, they wouldn't be still in existing today. So it's just a very simple point I'm trying to make is you need, number one, environment in which vines can grow old, and number two, they had to be economically viable. So that's where the danger is of old vines today, whether they're in Australia or Italy or California or any place, is are they of use to anyone? And that's the reason why it is a great idea now for all these regions to promote old vines per se. So we weren't doing that in California until only about 13, 14 years ago. And prior to that, honestly, people could take it or leave it. And so
I think Patricia Stevanovic, who's been answering a number of the questions as well, put on there, would like to actually have a chat with you about a point.
Actually, I just really wondered about, the idea of old vines, not in Lodi particularly because of the Zin, but also generally, and I love your idea that because of their deep roots and their ability to get nutrients and water from different strata is excellent. But I do also think that the economics can be difficult. So I did wonder whether yields, at which point the so-called old vines really start to drop their yields to make them even less economic than they might have been before. Sorry, Randy, I'm putting you on the spot here.
Oh, no, it's not on the spot because old vines exist in many different places and fashions and farming regimes, say in California, because in California we tend to have more old vines than other states here in the US. And so Historic Vineyard Society, for instance, will certify an old vineyard that's at least 50 years old if at least 1/3 of the vines are from that original planting. So, and that's an arbitrary sort of setting, but it's necessary because many of the old vineyards, especially in Sonoma County or Napa Valley, are not. They might be, they might date back to 1885 or 1901 or whatever the case may be, but most of the plants in the vineyard are much younger than that because vineyards die. And so it all depends on the site. Yeah, in many sites in Sonoma County, for instance, you're lucky if more than half of them are over 50 years old, because as the years go by, the vines die for whatever reason, and they have to be replaced. And so your typical Russian River old vine vineyard, for instance, is maybe about a third from the original date, and everything else is somewhere anywhere between, 5 to 75 years old. And so it all depends on the site, and if it's conducive to healthy grapevine growing. Now, I showed you a picture of the Bechtel vineyard that was planted in 1886, entirely to Sansol, not to Zinfandel. And the unusual thing about that particular vineyard is that over 95% of that vineyard dates back to 1886. It wasn't one of those continuously planted vineyards. I showed you another vineyard planted to Zinfandel called Lizzie James, and only about a third of the vines date back to 1904, the original planting date. Everything else is well, I would say nearly 2/3 of the vineyard is actually less than 50 years old. And so that just happens to be a different site. So economics have a lot to do with it. And, is it of value? And then the site in terms of the actual soil regime or the particular microclimate, all these things are huge factors in how a vineyard is valued and how old it can be, and the character it can start to express. Now, just because a vineyard is only 2/3 say younger vines and 1/3 older vine doesn't mean it's a lesser vineyard, because it's still a good site. And in actuality, when it comes to a varietal like Zinfandel, making wine from that vineyard, from some vines that are only 10, 15 years old, and some are 50 and some are 100, actually makes a really good wine. It makes a more complex wine. And so there are producers who are very cognizant of that, and they like to divide their blocks up. So they'll pick all the oldest vines, and then in another visit, they'll pick the middle-aged vines planted, say, in the 1950s and 60s. And then in another time, they'll pick the ones that are planted in the 1980s or afterwards, and when they do that, they find that the older vines tend to be a little bit better. However, there are many wineries that actually prefer to mix those blocks because they strongly believe it's certain parts of the vineyard makes a better wine, even though the grapevines are of different age. So there's all kinds of ways of looking at that. Now, that said, your question also pertained to to yield. Younger vines do yield more than older vines. There's no question about that. But any vineyard, it doesn't matter how old it is, 1 years old or 100 years old, they're not economically viable unless they produce a certain minimum amount of grapes. So, and that's why, again, those vineyards, old vine vineyards that are a mixed age, are very good because at least they get a yield that helped by the younger vines that makes the vineyard economically viable. But if it's in a vineyard where the entire amount is only 1 ton, it's that vineyard, chances are, will not survive, just because it's just of no use. Can't make any money off of it, basically. I don't know if that helps.
No, that's fine. I do have a follow-up question. I'm preempting Winnie's hand, and I'm so sorry. And it's actually to do with and I'd love to know if in Lodi you have this issue with pruning wounds and trunk disease on old vines.
Mm-hmm. Well, you probably know this whole, I guess, recent revolution of pruning, where you're trying to get more sap flow and minimize deadwood, and that's been applied mostly to trellis vineyards, are based on old vine viticulture, and so spur pruning, where you're where you're putting with leaving 2 canes on every spur, is a minimal damage type of pruning that is more likely, to produce less deadwood and more healthy growth and more vascular flow. That's the whole essence, behind, today's pruning strategies is, how can I prune where I'm not damaging the grapevine? And it's very easy to do it in trellis systems. And number one, because the spurs and the trunks are not as large and not as healthy, and so and that takes us back to my original thesis at the beginning of the presentation, which is what is the way to train vines that are more likely to allow them to grow old, and that would has to be what they call a goblet. I mean, that's explains the existence of all those old vines all over Spain, where there are probably more old vines than anywhere. And they're all done in those, little tiny bushes, and there's less damage. There's less likely to you're less likely to damage when you're cultivating or pruning it, and that's where the damage is done, right? In pruning. So I don't know. Does that answer your question? So you're not forcing also the vines to grow on a certain wire in a certain direction and things like that, because grapevines are probably like people that the less freedom you give it, the more it resists. And no wonder after 25, 30 years, these type of vineyards, they just want to die. That's it. I'm done. I'm dead. I'm not going to be productive anymore. And so trellis vineyards are routinely replaced after 25 to 35 years for that very reason. Whereas a vertical trained or a spur prune head trained vineyard, that they theoretically can go on forever, as long as you treat it right, right? So
Thank you.
I don't know.
Perfect.
Yeah. Do you have any other thoughts about that?
Yes, Randy, I just wanted to say that in South Africa, as I said, we have the seal that has the year in which the vineyard was planted. But as the vines die, they're obviously replaced with new vines. But
Yes.
those vines will never ever, or the grapes from those vines will never ever find their way into this old vine wine. Those grapes are removed and put into either sold off or put into other wines, because the wine in the bottle will always be the one of the year on the seal. And of course, in South Africa now we have a huge training program on specific pruning for old vines, and it's very specific teams that go into the vineyards. to prevent all those wounds and stuff like that. And in fact, we've even got some old vines that have 24-hour security just after budding, because the grapes are very sought after. So people have lost their grapes literally days before harvesting, because somebody's come in the middle of the night and just helped themselves. But here, our wines will never have old or new grapes in them. It will only have the grapes that is depicted on the label.
That's an interesting rule. Yeah, so that's great if you can do it. What I'm trying to say,
I
a
would
lot of
say that's
in
not
a
the
lot of
case elsewhere.
yeah,
Certainly
because
in Rioja, people interplant with new vines, or they layer them, actually, Randy.
exactly,
In Rioja,
and
they often layer them.
and in California, say, I mentioned there are about 250 certified vineyards in the Historic Vineyard Society. Most of them are, like I said, it's only a smaller portion of them, go back to the original date. So it's just not possible to produce much wine from, if you're just going to say it's only going to come from the oldest vines. Well, that could just be 10 vines, right? You can't produce very much wine from there. And so in Lodi, most of our old vine vineyards are surprisingly from the original date. And that's because we had that unusual deep loamy sand. And so that's what's different. But if you have an old vineyard and it's on a hillside and the soil is only 5 feet deep, and that's more challenging. So
Thank you, that's that, Randy. There's a question here from Joanna I think in Portugal. Are you there, Joanna? Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I am in Portugal. Here in the Douro Valley, we have old vineyards, of course, not pre-phylloxera, so they were all planted after phylloxera. But the fact is, we noticed that some of these old vines, when you have those extreme weather occurrences, when you have drought, when you had really extreme cold, that the old vines, they behave better. So the root systems are very deep. They can be much more resistant than younger vines. I would like to know that if you feel the same in Lodi, that with extreme weather events, that they are more resistant. Thank you.
oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's across the board in the industry. It's the observation is during extreme weather, whether it's heat or cold or drought or excess water, older vines in certain blocks tend to produce the better wine. And so, and that has mostly to do with more extensive root systems, but also grapevine structure. If a grapevine it has had the opportunity to develop more vigorous trunks and spurs, they have more ability, to bring the nutrients and carbohydrates up from the ground to the canopy and to the fruit zones. And so, so that's the reason why the older vines tend to perform better. Here in California, the big issues has been drought and then excess heat in recent years, a lot of heat. Older vines react better to extreme heat and extreme drought. And then that's the reason why pruning is changing, even for trellis vineyards in regions such as Sonoma, Mendocino, Napa Valley, is again, when you apply pruning systems, that that pretty much duplicate the way you say prune a vine in that's head trained. You're training a vine that's better able to withstand the extremes of climate or changing climate, or or just vintage to vintage extremes. So 100% agreement with you, Joanna, though, about older vines having the advantage in extreme weather to produce better wine.
Thank you.
Okay.
Liz has got a quick question. Liz Sagis, go ahead, Liz.
Hello. First of all, I was absolutely intrigued by your figures on the yields, because we all think of old vines as only producing minimal yields. But that was something Pruhenchka said when she talked to us about old vines in Australia. I'm wondering, is it largely down to the soils? But the other question I've got takes us away from that aspect, but more to the marketing side. What's being done? You mentioned very briefly on projects by the Lodi growers, winemakers, but what's being done to make this wonderful resource and the wines from it more familiar, wider known throughout, so not just California, but further afield? Thank you.
Well, it is a really economic issue. First of all, because of increasingly lack of labor, and the cost of labor, especially, people just need to be paid more to be able to work in these vineyards. Is what it is there are going to be economic consequences if we can't utilize these older vines towards premium price wines. So that said, a lot of our old vine vineyards are still going into lower price wines. What I mean by that is, in United States terms, it's an $8 or $10 wine, or a $12 wine, or a $15 wine. Right now, if you have a vineyard that, say, produces less than 3 or 4 tons an acre, and it's only, and the grapes are only getting a certain level of pricing, that vineyard is not going to be economically viable. And it really needs to command a price from a winery that intends to produce a wine that's sold for at least $18 or $20. This is as it stands right now. I believe in 10, 15 years, that threshold is going to be closer to $30. If a winery is not willing to pay for grapes, in which they can profitably produce a wine that's sold for at least $30, that's not going to be profitable for the grape grower, because of the increasing costs of farming old vines. So this is the reason why in Lodi, yes, we have a recent push to try to promote old vines, and that's basically because we need to promote appreciation of those wines, with the thought process in that it needs to become an increasingly premium priced wine, as opposed to a value priced wine. Now, we all know Napa Valley already produces premium priced wines, but that has more to do with, their land values and their cost of farming, and because it's not about old vines there. It's about mostly Cabernet Sauvignon, but it costs 10 times more to farm Cabernet Sauvignon, say, in Napa Valley than it does in Lodi, because Lodi is not as high a cost of a region. But when it comes to old vines, yes, the fact that they have to be done by hand, and there are fewer hands than ever available to us, and these hands need to be paid more. That's what we're looking at over the next 10 to 20 years. So old vine wines have to be appreciated more, so wineries can charge more and represent them as something unique. And so this is why our focus also is on terroir. We want people to appreciate wines for where they're grown and the sensory qualities that come from specific vineyards. And which is a matter of fact, most of all the better old vine vineyards here in Lodi, they're not even labeled old vine. They're actually labeled by the name of their vineyard, because the fact that it says old vine, which is meaningless because it's not controlled, doesn't make it more valuable. But if you put a specific vineyard in there, like Kirschman Vineyard or Bechtold Vineyard or Lizzie Jane's Vineyard, or that is what the consumer and or the wine connoisseur, that's what they appreciate. They're appreciating Bechtold, Kirschman, Lizzie James, because they know old vine is just a marketing term, but they're buying the vineyard and because they know it's coming from an old vine planting, if that makes any sense.
I think we've almost come to the end of our session, actually. And there are only a couple of minutes left, so maybe the questions that are left there, or one question or so, we can answer via email. But I'd like to thank you, Randy, very much from all of us here. It was a wonderful session, fascinating, and I think we all learned a lot from it. So thank you very much for joining us and for the presentation.